Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I am going to be talking about The Seventh Cadence by Jim Wilbourne, the first book in the Continua Chronicles. So this is one I had meant to read for quite some time. I'd had the ebook for quite a while, and then Jim reached out to asking about sending me a copy for me to review. I'm like, okay, I just will read the one I've had for a really long time. And so I was glad to finally get to it. This is one I had some pretty mixed feelings on overall, and that's where it's always like, it's a little weird doing a review for a book for an author that you've interacted with. But if you've watched reviews on my channel, you know I always am going to be honest and give the feedback that I have on different books. And there's definitely some good and there's definitely some bad with this one for where I landed on for The Seventh Cadence. So starting with the good, I feel like there's a lot of really great ideas here that are being explored. One thing that really early on, right off the bat, that had kind of gotten my attention is we have a character who is looking at things very scientifically, and that character, Telly, is a keeper basically, and they are in charge of like keeping knowledge in trust essentially, and so they are going and researching and that kind of thing constantly. And so having immediately in like a fantasy magical world somebody coming from that scientific side is interesting. That's not something you see quite a lot. There are some other books that have done that for sure, including like, Sanderson has definitely done some of that stuff as well. But that kind of right off the bat I found to be a really interesting take. It also just has some other ideas that are done in a way that's a little bit different, including the idea of prophets and seers, which both exist and are both different, which at first I'm like, I feel like that'd be the same thing, but with the way that that's set up, where you have prophets who are able to kind of see big events, but seers can like drill in and are considered very dangerous because they can more actively control events. And so there were some things like that were set up that were very interesting. And overall, it's kind of, what happened for me is that despite the interesting ideas, the things that I was enjoying about it, I felt like a lot of things didn't really come together as a complete story. And then the negative side, the bigger thing was I felt like a lot of the events in this story just felt like they were being forced a bit. Like there was a predetermined goal, there was a predetermined, this is where we're going to be at the end, and we're just going to kind of push everything that way, whether or not it makes sense. So that was one of the things that kind of caused a little bit of an issue here. I think the story that's being told is interesting. We're looking at a world that we have the two different areas. We have the Dominion, which is in the desert, and we have the Hazora, which I'm probably mispronouncing. Also no surprise if you've seen a lot of my videos, I tend to probably mispronounce a lot of fantasy names, but and so the different characters we're following, I mentioned Telly. We also follow Navid, who is a seer, and he's sent to get Telly. And then we're also following Gabriel, who is a prince of the Hazora kingdom as well. And so those are the main ones we're following. We do have a few other characters that kind of come in and are here and there throughout as well. Those are kind of the big ones. We start focusing mostly on Telly and Navid, and then we spend some more time with Gabriel and then kind of switch off. And in like the second half, we do a little bit more. But the base plot line is there's a war brewing. The Dominion is coming to try to attack and take over Hazora and bring them under their religious views and go from there. And it's everybody's trying to basically stop in different ways. But there's also kind of the plot going on as well that involves one of the other unique things with this book, which is the wizard Titan, who sounds basically almost like a godlike figure, but is the source of all magic, is the wizard Titan. And so the wizard apparently at some point decided to leave the world and like step out of the world, and so the only magic now that exists is essentially through spells that are written down and that kind of like power themselves, that are based on things that he left to the world. So it was an interesting way to do it. I felt like with the science side of it too, I was expecting to really get to look into that more, because there was a scene really, really early on that stood out to me with Telly analyzing the science behind the spell, essentially, but we leave the magic system pretty soft, and don't explore it a whole lot. It's something that's definitely there, but I would have liked a little bit more explanation on, either the Wizard Titan or how this magic works, and that's not something that's explored a whole lot in this book. So that's where it's kind of like an interesting idea, but I didn't feel like I got quite enough depth into it to really pull me in. And so those were some of the other things. And with the things where I said it just kind of felt like it was forced, and keeping it spoiler-free, of course, since I'm doing a spoiler-free review for this one, there were times where characters just seemed to make a decision, or something happened to characters, and it didn't necessarily make sense if you thought about it, but it seemed like it was kind of going toward a goal. And that's why it would happen. There were times where we just would spend a lot of time with the character, and then we would not spend time with them, or like something would happen to make it so that characters have to split up, that kind of thing. There were a lot of instances of that where it just felt like it was pushing things along, and I'm like, I don't feel like this makes sense for the characters to necessarily do this, or for things to happen. But that kind of is where that went as well. There were some other things that were just a little bit odd, where sometimes characters just would all of a sudden be somewhere. We wouldn't really get any details on how they got there, or occasionally it would happen in smaller ways where it's like, oh, this character's now here. And there was one particular one fairly early on where there wasn't really a lot of explanation. I actually had to go back and read them, like, did something happen here? Because they were clearly somewhere else, and now all of a sudden they're here. And I went back and I'm like, oh, it does kind of say they came out, but we skip details sometimes. And the weird thing about that is it's a pretty long book, so I feel like we really should have those details when we're in like the 700 page range. It's where this is one of those books where I don't know if it needed to be as long as it is, especially with parts that are a little bit streamlined. I think that makes a little bit more sense in a book that's maybe half the size, versus when we have the extra page count and you're reading that many pages anyway. I usually want a little bit more of that detail in. There were some things with the ending too that just felt a little bit rushed, or felt like it was a little forced with how things happened. And there were some pretty big events toward the end that we just don't really get any information or really explore at all. It's just specifically like, here are the touchstones, what we need our characters to do, and we're just going to kind of ignore everything else. And so that was another thing that just brought me a little bit down overall in the story. There were two characters as well who we spent a fair amount of POV time with that served no purpose that I can tell. Now, from what I've heard, I think they're supposed to be more involved in later entries, but it just felt like we devoted a fair amount of page time, and they did not really affect the story at all, at least in the first book, and so that is something I was wondering about as well. Overall, the book definitely could use some strong editing as well, and I'm sending, with a lot of books like this, I take notes on stuff, and I'm sending it to the authors. Hopefully, like, that kind of stuff can be resolved, but I feel like that was something, just some strong editing probably needed for both some of the errors and just content for some things that didn't necessarily always make sense. But I do think this is one of those books, like I said, there are a lot of good things here. It didn't necessarily come together for me in this first entry. I do think that there is potential for this series continuing to elevate further. I know this is a debut as well, and so with a debut, sometimes you can just see those things where it's a new author and they're not necessarily sure exactly how they're going to handle everything, that kind of thing. And so it's something where I think there's definitely room to grow here, and there's definitely potential for this to turn into a series that I'm enjoying more. It reminded me, not really in content, like the story is extremely different, but the story it kept reminding me of, just because I had some similar feedback, was The Bane of All Things by Leah Valiquette, which now that I would say that, I wonder if there's a sequel coming out for that one at some point. But anyway, that was also a debut. Had some of the similar things where just like new author seemed like they weren't necessarily sure how to have some things come together, but felt potential. So it's the point there. I mean, being a series that I definitely would be willing to continue. I ended up at about 3 stars for this one. So for me, not a bad rating. Really, it's just kind of, it definitely has its flaws. but overall it's well written. It's a good story, and so it's something that has potential, and I'll be interested to see where it goes, even though I'm not as high as I know a lot of people were on this first book. I know a lot of people have enjoyed this a lot more than I did, and I didn't by any means like hate the book. It just, for me, it was one of those books where I wanted to enjoy it more. There were parts where I'm like, oh, it's trending upward, but there were just other things that I just couldn't ignore, and that just kept going through my head. I'm like, I don't like the way that this happened, and things like that. And so that's kind of me as a reader. It tends to happen as well. So this is something I think definitely, if you're interested in kind of digging into seeing some unique ideas for fantasy, just like trying some different things, this definitely felt like that kind of novel where Jim Wilbourne, the author, is like, I want to try these different things, take a different approach to certain types of plot lines, or add different things. Bits of the world building are, even though you'll find some things that are familiar, other things are quite different. Like I talked about the use of magic, the kind of the focus that science also has, just different. There are certain characters that you'd like, the archetypal character would be different in a lot of stories, and so I think it's definitely experimenting, trying something a little bit different, and some of it worked for me and some of it didn't, but I'll be interested to see where it ends up going for me. This one, like I said, didn't quite land for me overall, but I think there's still definitely a lot of good. And if you're interested by any of the things that I said, definitely one that you may want to check out. And like I said, most people I know that have read this, I've rated this higher than I have, so it could just be me. I am nitpicky sometimes, but I think it's one of those stories. Like I said, it does feel like a debut. I don't know why I just said it that way. It does feel like a debut, and it does feel like a newer author who's still kind of figuring some things out, but it does have potential to go on, and so I'll be interested to see. I completely forgot to mention the dragons, which, I mean, it's not a spoiler because there's a dragon on the cover, but the dragons also were definitely interesting in a different take as well. So that's something too where we don't spend a ton of time necessarily with them. It's kind of there throughout, but that idea there too, which, because the cover is really awesome, is the first thing that caught my eye about the book. I still love the cover and the way the dragon is portrayed and everything, but it's also, once again, taking kind of a different spin on some things like that. So a lot of stuff here that's done in an interesting way, and I'll be interested to see where Jim Wilbourne goes in the future. So those are really my thoughts on the Seventh Cadence by Jim Wilbourne. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the link in the description, as always, for the Wizardly Do It Discord. If you want to chat books, whether this book, other books, any books, really anything at all, it is a lot of fun, and we would love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.